All right, continuing on, we're on the inside or middle of our newspaper now. Once again, I'm going to go through and read it out loud and help you out with what to highlight. You can highlight right on your screen, which you'll see me doing, or if you have a printed copy, you can use your highlighter. So we're reading about Arizona's transition into statehood, and we know that it was not necessarily an easy thing for Arizona to become a state. It took a lot of work and a lot of arguing on our part, but it was so important to Arizonans to become a state instead of a territory because we wanted to be able to choose our own leaders. That's a really, really important thing for people in general. It's important to have a voice and have a say in the people who are making your rules and your laws. So in this inside part of the newspaper here, we're going to talk about all the obstacles that we faced on our way to becoming a state. Arizona should not be a state. Okay, so Arizona was a pretty remote place with few people, but by the early 1880s, things had really started to change. Improved transportation and communication, railroads and telegraphs, made it possible for many people to move to Arizona. In fact, between the years 1880 and 1887, the population went from 40,000 to about 90,000 people. That's a big jump. That's more than double. Geronimo, the famous Apache, surrendered in 1886. Great lawmen like Sheriff Slaughter were getting rid of outlaws all over the territory. With these changes in favor of growth, why were people in Washington, D.C. so grumpy about Arizona becoming a state? Have you ever noticed that it sometimes takes a long time to get credit for all the growing up you've done? Grown-ups often remember you as the little kid you were a few years ago, don't they? It was the same for the territory of Arizona. Even though Arizonans had made positive changes, people in Congress still thought of Arizona as a huge desert in the West where outlaws roamed freely. They also said that Arizona didn't make enough money to be a state and that the population was still too small. No more Democrats? What's wrong with being a Democrat? Nothing if you asked anyone in Arizona in the late 1880s. I'm just going to highlight this, late 1880s. That might come up later. But if you asked that question in Congress, you'd get a different answer. Congress was led by Republicans who favored laws that helped big business. That's another important point there, so I'm going to highlight that. My cursor doesn't want to work. Let's see if I can get around that one. Congress, there we go. That's another important point there. Highlight that. Arizona had many miners and farmers who were mostly Democrats. Democrats favored laws that helped workers, like miners and farmers. So Arizona does not have a lot of big businesses. We have mostly miners and farmers, which is why our state was mostly Democratic early on. But Congress was mostly Republican early on. They really wanted to support those big businesses, and they favored laws that helped big business. So that's a big part of the reason why Congress was giving us a hard time about becoming a state. Republicans wanted to make sure there were more Republicans in Congress than Democrats so that they could continue to pass their own laws. One way for them to do this was to keep territories that were mostly Democratic, like Arizona, from becoming states. So we want to say territories that were mostly Democratic, like Arizona. That's another important point there, so I'm going to highlight that. Orders from Santa Fe. One suggestion for Arizona statehood was to let Arizona and New Mexico become one state. You might remember them talking about that on our field trip to the state capital. I'm going to highlight that. That's a pretty important point. Each state was allowed to have 2 senators in Congress, a group of leaders who represent the people. Because New Mexico and Arizona were both territories with Democratic leaders, the Republicans in Congress liked this idea. Then there would only be 2 Democratic senators added to Congress instead of 4. Of course, Arizonans went bonkers over the idea. Our ancestors didn't want to be governed from Santa Fe, New Mexico. New Mexico was more of an agricultural state, while Arizona was more of a mining state. I'm going to highlight that because that's going to come up later. So New Mexico did a lot of farming. That's what this word agricultural means there, where Arizona did a lot of mining. So even though we both had similar political views, we did not have the same type of economy going on, and that made a big difference in our willingness to become one big state. The Arizonans were afraid there would be higher taxes on mines than on farms and ranches. The people in both territories took a vote, and Arizonans voted strongly against becoming one state with New Mexico. So much for that idea. We don't want your money. 100 years ago, most people used gold for money. But here in Arizona, we had a lot of silver. Now, I'm sure some of you are thinking right now, wait a minute, we had a lot of copper, but we did have a lot of silver as well. And that's an important point that's going to come up later. We didn't have a lot of gold, so we weren't able to really use gold for money. Of course, everyone likes what they have the most of, so Arizona was noted for trying to get the rest of the country to use silver for the national currency. Here in Arizona, we use silver as our legal currency, but Congress didn't like the idea. They thought that this was a big problem. This was yet another bump in the road toward Arizona statehood. Phew, is there anything that Congress did like? So far, it certainly doesn't seem like it. Constitutional Convention. Did our founding fathers give up easily? No way. In fact, they never gave up. Most Arizonans thought that Arizona was ready for statehood back in the 1880s. To get prepared, the leaders of the territory wrote a constitution for Arizona statehood way back in 1891. That's going to come up again later, so I'm going to highlight that. This constitution was a document that outlined the laws that would govern the new state. Congress rejected this proposal, though, and denied Arizona statehood. If you wanted something badly enough, would you be willing to argue about it for 20 years? I'm sure a lot of you are thinking, absolutely, I love arguing, and your parents are probably nodding their heads in agreement. Well, that's just what Arizonans did. After 20 years of arguing, Congress finally passed an enabling act in 1910 that allowed Arizona to become a state. It took about 17 months to write a constitution and get it approved, but finally on Valentine's Day, 1912, Arizona became a state. There we go. I'm going to highlight that because that will come up in our questions. 48 is great. What a party. Can you imagine the celebration? After 20 years of struggling to make it happen, Arizona became the 48th state. As the news came in over the telegraph, there was so much noise in the streets that a visiting foreigner would have thought we were at war. Pistols were fired into the air everywhere. The town of Bisbee gets the prize for excitement. On a mountain nearby, they had a huge dynamite explosion dedicated to Arizona statehood. And you can see if you're looking at your larger version of the newspaper, you can see a picture of the state capitol. So this is the same building that we went to on our field trip. This building was finished in 1900 before we even became a state. So even before we became a state, we were working so hard at it that we created that Capitol building anyway. All right, tune in to the next video for the last section of your newspaper. I will be reading that out loud to you as well.